In 1847, in the soot-choked town of Wolvercote, England, where the air hung heavy with coal dust and the church bells cut through the smog like mournful cries, whispers began to circulate about a priest who had stepped beyond the boundaries of his sacred duty. Father Elias Darnell was, to all appearances, a man of compassion, a steady figure in a community eroded by poverty and grief. He baptized their children, blessed their dead, listened to their sorrows with patient calm. Yet as dusk fell and the faithful returned to their homes, Father Darnell lingered in the stone bowels of St. Bartholomew's Church, descending into its crypt long after the last candle had been snuffed. Villagers swore they heard him below the earth, sometimes praying, sometimes chanting, sometimes letting out sounds that were too jagged, too raw to be mistaken for devotion. At first, parishioners dismissed it as fervent piety, a priest battling unseen demons on behalf of his flock. But soon, something far darker took root, the discovery of his private journals, pages scrawled with words that could not be easily explained away. Some described rituals, fragments of confessions not given to him but spoken by him. There were accusations that seemed to point toward his parishioners, hidden sins of theft, cruelty, even murder, written in a hand that suggested knowledge no outsider could possess. But the lines blurred, twisted, leaving readers unsure whether Darnell was recording what others had admitted or unveiling horrors of his own. One passage spoke of a child buried without a name beneath the flagstones, another of blood spilled in the Lord's house as an offering he never asked for. To psychologists who later studied these fragments, the writings reflected a mind collapsing under repression and guilt, his words spilling into madness shaped by his austere faith and the suffocating secrecy of the church. To theologians, the accounts were blasphemous evidence of a priest entangled in heresy, perhaps possession. And to the villagers who once trusted him, the documents became something more terrifying, a record of sins no one dared claim, yet sins that seemed to hang over Wolvercote like a shroud. The church, faced with scandal, chose silence, locking the papers away in dust and darkness, hoping that time would swallow the shame. But time did not erase them. Instead, the name Father Elias Darnell became an echo in the town's history, invoked in hushed tones whenever a child vanished near the riverbank or a grave was found disturbed. Tonight, we do what the church never intended. We descend into those crypts of memory, into the place where holiness and corruption intertwined, where confession no longer separated the innocent from the guilty, but instead revealed how thin the line between them truly is. And as we examine these haunted words, the question still lingers, unresolved and unsettling. Was Father Darnell a shepherd who absorbed the sins of his people until they devoured him? Or was he the wolf disguised in priestly robes, feasting on the faith of those who trusted him most? Elias Darnell was born in 1812 in the soot-streaked town of Wolvercote, a place where coal smoke veiled the skies and poverty weighed on every doorstep. Yet faith still flickered in the dim light of church candles. His family, like so many others, struggled to survive. His father, a miner, died when Elias was barely 5, swallowed by the earth in a shaft collapse that left his mother with 3 children and little means of keeping them alive. And yet, from the beginning, villagers noticed something unusual about Elias. Where other children were rowdy and mischievous, he was quiet, contemplative, seemingly more at ease in silence than in play. He would sit near the church wall, eyes fixed not on games or laughter, but on the shadow of the crucifix stretching across the cobblestones. Many remembered him as kind, even saintly in his innocence, willing to share what little bread he had, willing to comfort a weeping child whose father had also perished in the mines. Mothers whispered that there was something angelic in the boy, though some quickly corrected themselves, adding with a nervous glance that angelic could easily turn to otherworldly. For even then, stories circulated animals found dead in peculiar arrangements in the fields near the Darnell cottage, their bodies forming rough circles or crosses in the grass. His mother, a woman of brittle health and deep piety, was said to fall into sudden fits after long prayers with her son, convulsions that she herself called visitations. Was it simply grief and poverty pressing down on her fragile frame, or something else entirely? No one could say for certain, but the association with Elias lingered in the back of every villager's mind. Despite these whispers, his path into the priesthood seemed inevitable. When he was old enough, Elias was sent to the seminary, where his reputation blossomed with startling speed. Parish records and letters from instructors described him as a prodigy of faith, a young man with a gift for oratory, capable of making even the most hardened skeptic lean forward in awe as he spoke. He seemed to know the scriptures not just by study, but by heart, reciting entire passages with tears in his eyes, his voice trembling as though touched by divine fire. His sermons as a student were remembered for their beauty, compassionate, poetic, urging kindness to the poor and mercy to the sinner. His fellow seminarians, however, sometimes whispered of his nocturnal habits. He was often absent from the dormitories at night, slipping into the woods surrounding the seminary grounds, not returning until dawn with soil under his fingernails and an expression neither weary nor refreshed, but as if he had been somewhere utterly beyond reach. Some claimed they heard him speaking in tongues beneath the trees, others that he carried books not sanctioned by the church, texts worn and bound in cracked leather with symbols no one recognized. When he returned to Wolvercote as Father Elias Darnell in the late 1830s, he was welcomed as a kind of savior. The parish, long burdened by fire and brimstone priests who spoke more of damnation than salvation, now found itself under the guidance of a man who radiated humility. He tended to the sick when cholera swept through the town, holding the hands of the dying as others recoiled in fear of contagion. He baptized infants, buried minors, and gave sermons that made the poor feel seen, the grieving feel comforted, the broken feel whole. For a time he was revered not just as a priest but as something almost mythic, a man of God who walked among them with gentleness in every step. Parish records from those years describe packed pews, villagers listening with rapt silence as he spoke not of hell but of forgiveness, not of wrath but of love. It was said that even hardened criminals confessed with trembling voices beneath his gaze, convinced that this priest saw through their lies and into the marrow of their souls. And yet, beneath this adoration, the shadows persisted. Rumors resurfaced about the boy who had grown into the priest. Farmers claimed that when Darnell walked through their fields at dusk, the livestock stirred nervously, as if sensing something unseen. His housekeeper once swore that she woke in the night to find him standing barefoot in the garden, eyes closed, arms raised to the moon, as if invoking something not found in scripture. Other nights he disappeared entirely, slipping away into the woods, not returning until morning, exhausted and silent. The duality of his existence began to trouble those who watched closely, the saintly priest who soothed the sick by day, and the shadowed figure who vanished by night. Some villagers called it the weight of holiness, a burden only he could bear. Others, more suspicious, muttered that he was touched by shadows, a vessel for something that did not come from God at all. Historians who later examined these accounts found themselves torn. On one hand, there was undeniable evidence of his virtue, letters from widows praising his comfort, notes from doctors acknowledging his tireless care during epidemics, even church reports that lauded his dedication to the poor. But alongside these records were anecdotes that refused to fit neatly into sainthood. One schoolteacher recalled seeing Darnell in the church long after midnight, kneeling before the altar not in prayer but in what looked like silent argument, his lips moving rapidly, his hands clenched as though fighting invisible chains. A miner claimed that, after confessing a violent act, he heard the priest mutter words he could not understand, and afterward, the man dreamed for weeks of shadowy figures whispering his crime back to him in the dark. Such stories, though unverifiable, persisted in oral history, and they painted a portrait of a man split between light and darkness. His rise was not simple sainthood, nor simple corruption. it was the unsettling coexistence of both. Perhaps this is why he became so compelling, both in his own time and in the fractured records he left behind. He was loved, even adored, for his compassion. But he was feared too, in a way no one could quite articulate. It was as if the villagers of Wolvercote sensed that their priest was not merely a man carrying the sins of others, but a man whose very soul balanced precariously between salvation and damnation. This duality would define the rest of his life, casting every act in ambiguity. Was his midnight walk a vigil of prayer or a secret ritual? Was his healing touch the hand of God or a mask for something else? To some, Father Elias Darnell embodied holiness itself. To others, he was a man already drifting into shadow, a figure whose rise was not toward sainthood, but toward something far more disturbing. And as his journals would one day reveal, the truth was far more complicated than either side dared imagine. For within the rise of Father Darnell lay the seeds of his eventual collapse, theatered, priest who would become a symbol of both faith and horror, innocence and corruption, salvation and damnation, remembered not for the light he brought, but for the darkness he left behind. In 1847, when Father Elias Darnell first put pen to paper in what would become his notorious journals, the entries were unremarkable, the quiet murmurs of a priest burdened with the weight of souls in his care, the tone confessional but ordinary, filled with prayers for mercy, reflections on Scripture, notes about parishioners who came seeking guidance, and the typical struggles of a man striving for holiness in a place so deeply afflicted by poverty, illness, and death. Yet as the months turned into years, a strange metamorphosis overtook the pages, as though some invisible hand had seized the pen, and what began as a record of pastoral care transformed into something far darker, something that has baffled and horrified scholars for more than a century. The earliest entries breathe with ordinary piety. O Lord, give me strength to comfort the widow of Thomas Gray, or may the sins of young Robert be lifted, that his hand no longer strikes his wife, or fear the coffin Mary's chest will claim her before the winter ends. Yet I place her in thy mercy. But soon the words began to shift in tone, not all at once, but in flickers, like light faltering before it gives way to shadow, a phrase here, an image there, an intrusion into the holy cadence of prayer that suggested something festering beneath the surface. By the summer of that year, he was writing not of the living parishioners, but of blood that cries beneath the stones, and when one reads this line in the cracked leather-bound journal, still preserved in fragments in the Wolvercote Historical Archive, the ink almost seems darker, thicker, as though pressed onto the page with a desperate or fevered hand. Then comes the passage about children who vanished into the earth, a line that at first was dismissed by early archivists as poetic symbolism, a priest imagining the loss of innocence, the return of all souls to dust, until someone cross-referenced the entry with missing persons reports from Wolvercote in those same years, and discovered that indeed, 2 children had vanished in 1847, never to be found, their disappearance unexplained, their names Margaret Lane and Samuel Carter lingering in police ledgers as unsolved mysteries. The possibility that Darnell's words were more than allegory has haunted historians ever since. As the journals deepen, their tone becomes even more troubling, not the voice of a man simply describing the sins of others, but of one who is himself caught between revelation and admission, as though he no longer knew whether he was writing as a priest interceding for his flock, or as a sinner confessing crimes of his own. Entries speak of rituals the flock cannot know, performed in silence where the earth is hollow, of chains that ring when all else sleeps, of faces pale in candlelight, waiting for absolution that cannot be given. Some passages are fragmented, almost delirious, as though he wrote them in feverish haste, and others are eerily precise, naming locations, times, and obscure biblical references twisted into shapes that justify grotesque imagery. One line reads, "The well beneath the vestry drinks what the chalice cannot," a statement that has provoked endless speculation about whether there was some hidden chamber beneath the church, some forgotten crypt where horrors were enacted. Villagers in later testimony, collected long after Darnell's death, recalled hearing noises beneath the church at night, scraping, weeping, metallic clinks like chains dragging against stone, and while skeptics argue that such memories are the inventions of hindsight, colored by the knowledge of the journals, the consistency of the accounts across different sources is difficult to ignore. One of the most chilling features of the journals is how seamlessly the sacred and the profane intertwine, as if Darnell himself could not distinguish where prayer ended and blasphemy began. For example, an entry from November 1848 begins, "Forgive me, O Lord, for I am but dust, and I lift to thee the cries of my children," which sounds innocuous enough until the next line declares, "But their cries come not from lips of the living, but from beneath the floor, and I cannot still them." Such passages leave scholars torn between interpretation and horror. Was Darnell speaking metaphorically of the burden of parishioners' sins, or was he acknowledging that actual cries came from beneath the church floor, cries of the buried or imprisoned? Another entry reads, "The sacrament is given, the chalice raised, but in the cellar below another sacrament is performed, when the flock must never know, lest they scatter like sheep in terror." It is in lines like this that the journals abandon the safety of interpretation and demand confrontation with the possibility that something truly terrible was happening within those church walls, some hidden rite parallel to the liturgy above, echoing in darkness while hymns rang in daylight. Villagers who lived through those years remembered strange disruptions during Darnell's services, though none dared voice them at the time. A woman named Elizabeth Morley, in testimony recorded decades later, recalled that during communion in 1849, she heard a faint sound beneath the pews, like moaning, though no one else acknowledged it, and Father Darnell's hand trembled as he lifted the host. Another villager, Thomas Red, claimed he saw smoke rising from the cracks in the church floor late at night when he passed by, though whether this was smoke, candlelight, or the product of his own fearful imagination remains uncertain. The question that emerges from such accounts is whether Darnell's journals were a symbolic register of the community's grief and sin, his way of internalizing the suffering of a dying town, or whether they were confessions of acts he himself committed, dark deeds concealed beneath the mask of pastoral care. The most disturbing entries come in 1850, when his writing reached its fever pitch, entire pages filled with frantic scrawls. "The child is taken, the earth drinks again, the circle is made, the prayer is broken, the promise sealed." Another reads, "I walk among them in daylight, and they see only the shepherd, not the wolf, not the blood upon my hands, not the fire that eats at my heart." At times he seems to plead for release. "Lord, if these are my sins, cleanse me, for I cannot stop. If these are theirs, lift them from me, for I cannot bear." The ambiguity is maddening. Was he recording the sins of those who confessed to him, taking them into himself as priests symbolically do, or was he revealing his own? That he blurred the line so thoroughly suggests either a descent into madness or a deliberate attempt to confess without confessing, to write his guilt in riddles that only God could truly understand. Historians continue to debate the authenticity of the crimes implied in the journals. Some argue that Darnell, weighed down by the relentless misery of his parish, began to experience religious psychosis, transforming ordinary tragedies into grotesque visions that he recorded as though they were real. Others, however, point to the disturbing correspondences between his words and documented events: the missing children, the unsolved disappearances of vagrants, the reports of strange sounds in the church, and argue that the journals may be the closest thing we have to a record of secret atrocities committed under the guise of priestly duty. Even the church itself has wavered on how to treat the writings. For decades they were hidden, declared apocryphal, too dangerous for public reading, until fragments were reluctantly released to scholars in the late 19th century, sparking a century-long debate about whether Father Darnell was a saint, tormented by visions of sin, or a monster hiding in plain sight. What is certain is that the confessions he wrote, whether of others or of himself, blurred every line between holiness and horror. He became both priest and penitent, both shepherd and wolf, a man who carried sins but perhaps also committed them. His journals remain one of the most chilling artifacts in ecclesiastical history, not because they prove guilt, but because they make it impossible to know where innocence ends and darkness begins. The confessions begin as prayers, but they end as something far more ambiguous, far more terrifying. An open question that still echoes through Wolvercote's history: was Father Elias Darnell confessing the sins of his flock, or was he finally, in his own cryptic way, confessing his own? In the decades following the discovery of Father Elias Darnell's journals, the world of scholars, priests, and amateur historians alike fractured into camps of explanation, each attempting to wrestle meaning out of the fevered pages that lay in brittle fragments within Wolvercote's parish archives. And in that fracture one can glimpse the eternal struggle between science and superstition, reason and faith, the need to diagnose versus the urge to condemn. For on one side stood the rationalists who insisted that no priest, however devout or corrupted, could write of children who vanished into the earth, or blood that cries beneath the stones without the influence of madness, while on the other stood believers who argued that the very precision of Darnell's imagery proved he was not merely sick but immersed in forbidden rites, recording horrors that had truly transpired beneath the church. The rationalists, often physicians or early psychologists of the Victorian era, argued that Darnell exhibited all the hallmarks of schizophrenia, particularly the religiously infused mania so commonly recorded in medical treatises of the 19th century, with symptoms such as auditory hallucinations, delusional thinking, and the tendency to interpret ordinary events as cosmic signs, pointing to the frantic repetition in his later journals, phrases written over and over until the ink tore the page, desperate invocations of forgiveness followed by grotesque imagery as clinical evidence of a mind unraveling beneath the crushing weight of psychosis. And modern scholars have elaborated on this diagnosis, suggesting that his insistence on secret rituals and hidden cries was the projection of an overburdened psyche, a man who internalized every sin confessed to him until his imagination burst into hallucination, constructing an alternate world of blood and chains beneath the very floor where he preached mercy and salvation. Others have posited ergot poisoning, citing that Wolvercote, like much of rural England, relied heavily on rye bread, and that the damp conditions of the coal town were perfect for the growth of Claviceps purpurea, the mold whose alkaloids can cause hallucinations, convulsions, paranoia, and visions so vivid that entire communities, such as those in France during the medieval St. Anthony's fire, outbreaks believed themselves besieged by demons. And if Darnell consumed such bread regularly, it might explain the blend of piety and terror in his writing, the visions of cries beneath the stones, the belief in rituals unfolding in darkness, hallucinations seamlessly woven into his theology until the difference between spiritual battle and physical crime collapsed entirely. Still other rationalists, unwilling to lean on medicine alone, have argued for metaphor, claiming that the journals are not confessions at all but allegories, coded writings meant to expose corruption within the church, perhaps abuses Darnell witnessed but dared not name directly. For in the rigid structure of 19th century Catholicism, a priest who denounced fellow clergy risked ruin, exile, or worse, and so he buried his accusations in metaphor, using images of vanishing children and hidden rituals as veiled references to exploitation, coercion, and the unspoken crimes of institutions cloaked in sanctity, thus making the journals a desperate whistleblower's cry rather than a madman's rambling. Yet for every rational explanation, a counterfeit rises, stern and unyielding, insisting that such arguments are the very blindness of modernity, the refusal to see the supernatural woven into the world as surely as stone and blood. Believers in the occult insist that Darnell's writings are not the products of disease, but of practice, that his confessions are as literal as they sound, documenting real rituals tied to ancient traditions long whispered about in English folklore, where priests in lonely parishes were said to traffic with spirits, seeking power or protection in exchange for secret rites performed beneath church floors. And folklorists who have traced these myths point to uncanny parallels. Tales from Cornwall of clergymen who summoned shadows in order to secure good harvests. Legends from Yorkshire of midnight masses where black candles were lit not for Christ, but for darker patrons. And most chillingly, records from Oxfordshire itself of 17th-century priests accused of walking with the hidden ones in exchange for influence over their flock. To these folklorists, Darnell was not insane, but simply another link in this chain of clandestine bargains. His journals are a rare surviving artifact of a practice otherwise erased by the Church's careful suppression. A glimpse into the subterranean world where Christian symbols were inverted, chalices raised not to sanctify but to desecrate, and prayers twisted into incantations that blurred the line between absolution and damnation. Theologians, too, have weighed in. Though divided, some argue that Darnell's writings are the result of demonic oppression, that his long nights in the crypt left him vulnerable to spiritual assault, that the voices he recorded were not hallucinations, but the whispers of malevolent beings eager to claim a soul weakened by solitude and pride. Others suggest possession itself, that his journals are the testimony of a man no longer in control of his own hand, writing words dictated by the very forces he sought to resist, which would explain the eerie way the text shifts between prayer and blasphemy, as though two voices fought for dominance across the same page. And in this view, the question of madness becomes irrelevant, for the true author was not Darnell at all, but the shadow that spoke through him. The clash between science and superstition has, if anything, only grown sharper with time. Modern psychiatrists reviewing the journals through digital scans argue that his patterns of repetition, the intrusive violent imagery, and the delusions of persecution align not merely with schizophrenia, but with what is now termed schizoaffective disorder, a condition that blends psychosis with mood disturbance, often religious in flavor when the sufferer is devout. Yet even these clinical voices concede that the correlation between his writings and real disappearances in Wolvercote complicates the picture, for hallucinations do not usually align with external events, and this anomaly continues to gnaw at the rationalist interpretation. Folklorists, emboldened by such gaps, argue that it is precisely this overlap, the way his visions coincided with missing persons, that proves their case, that he was indeed describing actual deeds, either his own or those of forces to which he had bound himself. Meanwhile, cultural historians have explored how Darnell's writings may reflect broader anxieties of his time, noting that mid-19th century England was rife with fear of hidden corruption, with scandals of clergy abusing their positions, with industrial towns haunted by child labor and vanishing paupers. And in this light, his journals may serve as both personal and cultural confession, a projection of collective dread onto the page, making him less an isolated madman and more a mirror of the shadows lurking in society itself. What emerges from these interpretations is not clarity, but deepening ambiguity, a tug-of-war in which each side pulls the figure of Father Darnell toward their own truth. To the physician, he is a case study in religious mania. To the folklorist, he is the latest vessel of an ancient pact. To the theologian, he is either saint under siege or sinner possessed. To the cultural historian, he is the voice of a corrupt era screaming through the mask of sanctity. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of this debate is that each interpretation reshapes his legacy entirely. If he was mad, then his journals are tragic, the record of a devout man destroyed by his own mind. If poisoned, then his visions were accidents of fungus and fate, a priest undone by bread as ordinary as his parishioners ate daily. If allegorical, then he was a prophet of corruption, silenced by the very church he sought to expose. And if literal, then He was either a sorcerer cloaked in vestments, or a priest dragged into the abyss by the very forces he sought to resist. No explanation erases the others, and so his story hangs suspended between them, a dark pendulum swinging between science and superstition, sanity and damnation, each theory casting light only to deepen the shadows of the others. And so the journals remain, brittle pages that invite interpretation but never surrender certainty, a puzzle that refuses solution, a mirror in which rationalists see psychosis, believers see demons, and the rest of us see only the terrifying possibility that both may be true at once. Was Father Elias Darnell insane, poisoned, a whistleblower, or damned? The question lingers unanswered, haunting every reader who dares open his words, for the deeper one looks, the less one knows whether the confessions reveal the sickness of a mind, the corruption of a church, or the whispers of something far older and darker than either, waiting still beneath the stones of Wolvercote, where faith and fear are one. In the years following the mysterious disappearance of Father Elias Darnell, the village of Wolvercote did not settle into silence but into whispers, and those whispers grew into stories carried by the survivors' descendants, witnesses, and the last living parishioners, each testimony dripping with contradiction, as if memory itself had been infected by the shadow he left behind. For one elderly woman, identified in local genealogical records as Margaret Ainsworth, claimed well into her 90s that she had seen the priest walking through the graveyard long after his official absence, his cassock brushing the wet grass, his head bent in prayer. But what she remembered most vividly was not Darnell himself, but the child who walked beside him, a pale boy with sunken eyes, who moved silently over mud yet left no footprints. And when pressed by her great-grandchildren, Margaret insisted that she had not been dreaming, that she had stood at her window on a storm-tossed night and watched them pass between the gravestones, as though time itself had folded back into place. Another account, taken decades later from a man named Samuel Carter, who had once been an altar boy under Darnell, painted a darker picture. For Samuel swore that he had been made to stand guard at the doors of the crypt during midnight rituals that did not resemble the holy sacraments he had been taught, but something altogether alien, where he heard chanting in a language he did not recognize, guttural and melodic, punctuated by silences that seemed to thrum with an unseen presence. And though Samuel confessed he never dared open the door, he described the sounds within as accompanied by scraping, by chains dragged across stone, by muffled cries that might have been prayer or pain. And when asked why he never told anyone at the time, Samuel's only answer was fear that he had been told by Darnell himself that speak would damn him more surely than silence, and so he carried that memory like a splinter in the soul until the day he confessed it to an interviewer in the 1890s. Still others recalled the aftermath of these supposed nights. Livestock found mutilated in fields, their blood soaking into the earth without tracks to explain what predator had come, or children waking to strange markings carved into their barn walls, spirals and crosses that scholars later matched to doodles inside Darnell's surviving journals, as if the private scratches of his pen had seeped out into the world around him, etching themselves on wood and stone without his hand. But even as these stories multiplied, not all testimony damned him, for there were those who remembered a different man entirely, a priest of compassion who fed the hungry, who gave his own meager wages to widows, who risked his life during the cholera outbreak of 1849 to tend to the dying when others fled, who wept openly at the graves of children taken by disease, his hands trembling with grief as he lowered the tiny coffins into earth. And one woman, Agnes Hollister, whose family survived the epidemic because of Darnell's tireless care, swore until her final breath that he was a saint among men, and that all stories of darkness were nothing more than envy and fear turned into lies by villagers eager to crucify the only man who dared carry their burdens. The tension between these competing memories thickened across generations, creating a fractured mosaic of a figure who was at once savior and monster, victim and perpetrator. And into that mosaic entered the interpretations of descendants who struggled with the legacy left in family records. For diaries from parish households mention unexplained drownings in the Arable stream. Small children swept away, though the water ran shallow. A pattern some linked to Darnell's warnings of the river's tithe. Phrases found, scribbled in his journals that suggested the water demanded offerings in exchange for protection, while others insisted these were coincidences, tragedies magnified by grief until they took on the shape of superstition. Yet the most disturbing accounts came from those who claimed to have seen him after his supposed vanishing. Shadowed figures on the moor resembling his tall frame, candles flickering in the church long after it had been sealed, whispers in the nave where no living priest walked, and even in the 20th century there were reports collected by folklorists of travelers who swore they saw a man in clerical garb standing at the edge of the loch, holding the hand of a child whose face they could never quite see, disappearing into mist before they could approach. Stories that blur the line between survivor testimony and haunting, leaving us to wonder whether Darnell ever truly left Wolvercote at all, or whether his presence lingered, half memory, half revenant, haunting both the living and the land itself. In these survivor accounts, we see not simply recollections of a priest, but the raw theater of human fear and longing. For every voice that condemned him as a devil in disguise was countered by another that raised him up as a man of God undone by suspicion. And the coexistence of these stories suggests less a man who was fully known than a figure projected upon, each survivor seeing in him the reflection of their own dread, their own hope, their own sin, so that the truth of Father Elias Darnell becomes not a fixed point but a prism, refracting different lights depending on where one stands, leaving us with testimonies that both accuse and absolve, terrify and console, forcing us into the same dilemma that faced his parishioners more than a century ago. Was he the shepherd who walked his flock through plague and hunger, or the wolf who led them into darkness? Or was he somehow, impossibly, both at once? As the decades rolled forward and the name of Father Elias Darnell became less the memory of a man and more the anchor for rumor, speculation, and whispered dread, theories multiplied like fungi in the damp corners of Wolvercote's abandoned church, each attempting to explain the contradictions left behind in his journals, each draped in equal measures of plausibility and madness. For one of the most enduring beliefs among local historians is that Darnell's writings were never meant as private meditations, but as coded testimonies, desperate attempts to document crimes he dared not speak aloud. Crimes committed not by himself, but by powerful men within the parish, landowners, magistrates, and even fellow clergy who preyed upon the weak, and that Darnell, caught between his vows of obedience and his moral revulsion, could do nothing but encode their sins into the margins of his sermons, recording abuses that ranged from sexual violence to ritual killings disguised as accidents, acts the villagers would never suspect of their so-called protectors. And in this theory, Darnell becomes less a monster than a reluctant archivist, a witness who bore the unbearable weight of knowledge and was eventually silenced for it. But the counter-theory, darker and more insidious, is that these crimes were not merely observed but committed by Darnell himself, that the reason his writings seethe with guilt and ambiguity is because he cloaked his own predations in the language of confession, hiding beneath the authority of his collar while committing sins too grotesque to name directly, so that when he wrote of children led to the water at night, or of flesh offered for protection, he was not describing others but himself. And the horror of this interpretation lies in how seamlessly his piety and depravity might have intertwined, each prayer becoming camouflage, each baptism perhaps a rehearsal for drownings not sanctified but desecrated, until the line between priest and predator collapsed entirely. Still others, unwilling to reduce his journals to crimes alone, argue that what we read in them are traces of something even more unsettling, that Darnell was engaged in forbidden rituals that merged Christian liturgy with fragments of pagan sacrifice, remnants of the old religion still whispered in the highlands, where blood and water were offered to appease forces older than the church itself. For in his writing, scholars have found curious repetitions, invocations that begin as Latin prayers and shift midway into unidentifiable syllables, chants that align with neither scripture nor known folklore, but which bear the structure of ritual language, as though he were weaving together the psalms with incantations dredged from forgotten wells of belief, suggesting that the priest's confessions were not merely admissions of sin, but liturgical experiments, attempts to fuse Christ with something primeval. And in this reading, his journals become less the diary of a guilty man than the manual of a heretic, the blueprint of a faith that was never meant to survive. Conspiracy theorists, of course, take this further, proposing that Darnell was silenced not for crimes or heresy, but for truth, that he uncovered a vein of corruption running through the church itself, hierarchies of bishops and cardinals complicit in crimes so terrible that to expose them would collapse the institution, and that his disappearance was not a mystery at all, but an execution, orchestrated by men who feared the spread of his words, who ensured that his body vanished and his journals were scattered, so that no single picture could emerge. And yet, perversely, their attempt to erase him gave birth to the myth, for the fragments that remain invite speculation, forcing each new generation to reconstruct the story in darker, stranger ways. And yet none of these theories, whether he was the recorder of crimes, the perpetrator, the heretic, or the martyr, fully account for the precision with which his confessions align with real events. Drownings that are documented in parish death registers, livestock mutilations confirmed by farmers' ledgers, disappearances noted in local gazettes, details too exact to dismiss as invention. And it is this chilling correspondence between text and reality that unsettles even sober scholars. For whether Darnell described what he saw, what he did, or what he imagined, the result is the same. His writings intersect with blood and grief, leaving us trapped in a labyrinth of explanation where every path leads to corruption, secrecy, and silence. And perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all is that the truth contains fragments of each theory, that Darnell was at once witness and participant, priest and predator, heretic and victim. His story not the neat narrative of innocence or guilt, but a convergence of horrors that defy resolution. And so when we sift through the ashes of testimony and theory, we are left staring not at the portrait of a man, but at the abyss he opened, an abyss where faith curdles into fear, where confession becomes evidence, where silence itself may be the most damning crime of all. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Father Elias Darnell vanished into silence, yet his name persists like a wound that refuses to heal, carried in whispers through the crumbling stones of St. Bartholomew's, and in the yellowing journals locked in parish archives, their pages so fragile they threaten to disintegrate at the slightest touch. And still the questions remain unanswered, each theory a mirror reflecting more shadows than light. For was Darnell a madman undone by visions born of illness, a man who saw demons not in the world, but in the fractured recesses of his own mind? Or was he something far more dangerous, a predator who used the cloth not to protect but to conceal, twisting prayer into cover for crimes whose victims remain nameless and voiceless, buried under both earth and secrecy? Or was he a vessel of a different kind, not criminal nor delusional, but chosen or cursed to glimpse truths no human should bear, truths of corruption, blood, and ritual stitched into the fabric of the very institution he served, until he carried those sins in himself, unable to separate his own guilt from the horrors he witnessed. Even today, St. Bartholomew's refuses to rest, its half-ruined nave echoing with winds that locals swear sound like chants, its sealed crypt rumored to exhale a coldness unlike any other corner of Wolvercote. And though skeptics dismiss the tales, villagers speak of midnight bells tolling, though the ropes have long since rotted away, of faint prayers rising from beneath the ground when no priest stands above to recite them, of shapes glimpsed in moonlight walking the graveyard paths, robes dragging across mossy stones, sometimes accompanied by the fleeting silhouette of a child who leaves no footprints. Some argue these stories are nothing more than the residue of fear, the human tendency to clothe silence with superstition, Yet the persistence of these accounts raises its own unease. Why do so many claim to hear the same things? To feel the same weight in the air when they linger too close to the church walls? The journals themselves are no less unnerving. Passages describing blood that cries beneath the stones align with actual drownings. Notes of faces that do not return from the water echo missing persons reports. Scribbles of symbols later discovered carved into barn walls and gravestones alike, leaving the modern reader unsure whether to interpret them as delusion or as a map of something deliberately hidden. In the end, the legacy of Elias Darnell is not clarity, but dissonance, a riddle that has outlived both his parish and his age, and perhaps that is why his story endures. For mysteries without resolution compel us more deeply than truths neatly tied. They invite us to peer into silence and see reflections of our own fears. Was Father Darnell confessing only his own sins, or was he confessing ours as well, revealing the darkness that festers wherever power is left unchallenged and secrets go unspoken? We cannot know, and so we are left with silence. And in silence the mystery grows, demanding belief, disbelief, or something in between, leaving us haunted by a final, unanswerable question. What do you believe?